Why the United States cares so much about Greenland. Some places remain absent from global attention for decades. They appear on maps but not in headlines. They exist in geography books, but rarely in political debates. Then, almost without warning, they return to the center of strategic discussion. Greenland is one of those places. For most people, it is associated with ice, isolation, and distance. A vast landmass with a small population, far removed from the centers of power that shape global politics. And yet, in recent years, Greenland has re-emerged as a point of strategic interest, particularly for the United States. This is not a sudden development. It is not driven by a single event, and it is not the result of short-term politics. To understand why the United States cares so much about Greenland today, we need to look at how geography, security, and global competition have slowly reshaped its importance. Because in geopolitics, distance does not mean irrelevance, and isolation often hides strategic value. Part 1. Greenland before global attention. For much of modern history, Greenland existed on the margins of global affairs. Despite being the world's largest island, its population remained small, scattered across a harsh and unforgiving landscape. The island's political status reflected this marginal role. Greenland is not an independent country. It is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, responsible for most of its internal affairs while relying on Denmark for defense and foreign policy. For decades, this arrangement attracted little international scrutiny. Greenland had no large economy. Its infrastructure was limited. Its strategic value appeared minimal in a world focused on temperate regions, trade hubs, and industrial centers. But geography does not change, even when attention does. Greenland sits between North America and Europe. It lies along the shortest air and missile routes connecting major powers in the Northern Hemisphere. For much of the 20th century, these facts remained secondary, until global security dynamics began to shift. Part 2. Why geography never stopped mattering. From a purely geographical perspective, Greenland occupies an extraordinary position. It stands at the gateway to the Arctic. It overlooks routes that connect the Atlantic and the polar regions, and it sits closer to North America than many parts of Europe. In times of peace, this positioning seemed abstract. In times of tension, it became decisive. Military planners have long understood that the shortest path between major powers often runs over the Arctic, not across oceans or continents. This reality was easy to ignore when long-range threats were limited. It became impossible to ignore when technology changed. As aircraft gained range and missiles gained speed, the Arctic transformed from a remote wilderness into a strategic corridor. Greenland was no longer distant, it was central. This shift did not immediately translate into public debate, but within defense and security circles, Greenland's location was never forgotten. It simply waited for conditions to change. Part 3. The Cold War and the return of strategic value. The Cold War marked the first major moment when Greenland's strategic relevance became undeniable. As the United States and the Soviet Union faced each other across ideological and military lines, the Arctic emerged as a critical space. Early warning systems, air defense networks, surveillance infrastructure all required presence in the far north. Greenland became part of that architecture. During this period, the United States established military facilities on the island, not as symbols of power, but as components of a broader defensive system. These installations were designed to detect threats early, monitor airspace, and reduce response times. They reflected a simple logic. If threats could arrive over the pole, defenses had to be placed there as well. For decades, this presence remained largely invisible to the public. Greenland was important, but quietly so. And when the Cold War ended, many assumed this importance would fade. Part 4. The illusion of irrelevance after the Cold War. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, global priorities shifted. Defense budgets shrank. Strategic focus moved away from existential threats. Remote regions lost attention. Greenland was no exception. For a time, it seemed as though the island's strategic role belonged to a previous era. The Arctic appeared frozen, politically and literally, but this perception was misleading. While geopolitical competition cooled, underlying realities remained unchanged. Geography did not move. Infrastructure did not disappear. Strategic corridors did not vanish. They simply became less visible. And as history often shows, periods of reduced attention rarely eliminate strategic importance. They only delay its return. By the early 21st century, the assumptions that had pushed Greenland to the background began to erode. Global competition re-emerged, technology evolved, environmental conditions shifted. What once seemed distant and irrelevant started to feel closer and more consequential. In the next block, we will examine how changes in the Arctic itself transformed Greenland from a forgotten outpost into a strategic priority once again. History does not revive old interests randomly. It revives them when conditions demand it. Part 5. When the Arctic itself changed. For much of modern history, the Arctic functioned as a natural barrier. Ice limited access, extreme conditions restricted movement. Seasonal windows were narrow and unreliable. This physical reality shaped political assumptions. The Arctic was difficult to traverse, expensive to operate in, and largely inaccessible for sustained economic activity. As a result, its strategic importance remained theoretical for long stretches of time. That reality began to change. Rising global temperatures altered the Arctic environment in ways that were gradual but cumulative. Ice coverage decreased. Seasonal melt periods extended. Previously impassable waters became navigable for longer portions of the year. This was not a sudden transformation, but it was a decisive one. As physical barriers weakened, strategic calculations shifted. What had once been a frozen buffer began to resemble a corridor, and Greenland, positioned at the heart of that corridor, became more visible. Part 6. New routes, shorter distances, different calculations. One of the most immediate consequences of Arctic change was the emergence of new maritime routes. As ice retreated, pathways connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans became increasingly viable. These routes offered something rare in global trade: distance reduction. Shipping times shortened, fuel costs dropped. Traditional choke points became less central. Even when these routes remained seasonal, their existence altered long-term planning. Global logistics does not adapt overnight, but it adapts to possibility. Once new routes become conceivable, investment decisions, infrastructure planning, and strategic positioning follow. For the United States, this development carried multiple implications. It affected global trade flows. It altered naval considerations. It reshaped how access and control might function in the future. Greenland's geographic position placed it adjacent to these emerging pathways, not as a destination, but as an observer and potential guardian. Part 7. Resources that were once unreachable. Beyond transportation, Arctic change exposed another layer of strategic interest: resources. For decades, the Arctic was known to contain significant reserves of minerals, hydrocarbons, and rare earth elements. But knowledge alone did not equal access. Extraction in extreme environments was technologically complex and economically uncertain. As conditions changed, that equation shifted. Improved access increased feasibility. Longer operational seasons reduced risk. Advances in technology lowered barriers. Greenland in particular, drew attention for its potential mineral wealth. Rare earth elements, critical materials used in modern technologies, resources increasingly central to economic and military supply chains. In a world where technological advantage depends on stable access to specific materials, geography becomes leverage. This did not mean immediate exploitation. It meant strategic consideration. Countries began to think less about what could be extracted today and more about who might control access tomorrow. For the United States, this raised a familiar concern. Supply chain dependence had become a vulnerability. Greenland represented not certainty, but possibility. Part 8. Security returns to the center. As economic and environmental factors reshaped the Arctic, security considerations returned with renewed force. The Arctic was no longer only about climate or commerce. It was about visibility, access, and response time. Modern security planning depends on detection and speed. Missile trajectories still cross polar regions. Aircraft routes still pass over high latitudes. Early warning systems remain anchored in northern geography. Greenland's location places it directly along these pathways. What had once been relevant during the Cold War regained relevance in a different technological context. The logic remained familiar. If threats can approach from the north, defense must be positioned there as well. But the environment had changed. Advances in missile technology, cyber systems, and surveillance altered the scale and speed of potential engagement. This increased the value of locations that allow early detection and monitoring. Greenland was not simply a legacy asset. It was a modern one. Part 9. Why climate change is a strategic multiplier. Climate change did not create Greenland's importance. It amplified it. By reducing physical barriers, it multiplied the impact of geography. What had once required extraordinary effort became achievable with sustained investment. This multiplication effect extended beyond any single domain. Economic opportunity overlapped with security concern. Environmental change intersected with global competition. Long-term planning replaced short-term neglect. For policymakers, this created a different kind of urgency. Not an emergency, but a narrowing window. Strategic positions, once ignored, were being reconsidered by multiple actors at the same time. And in geopolitics, simultaneous interest rarely leads to stability. It leads to competition. Part 10. Why Greenland felt different from other Arctic regions. Not all Arctic territories attracted the same level of attention. Many are firmly embedded within powerful states. Greenland is different. Its political status, limited population, and economic constraints create openness. Decisions about infrastructure, investment, and partnership carry outsized influence. This does not imply vulnerability, but it does imply strategic sensitivity. For the United States, engagement with Greenland presented a distinct profile. It combined strategic geography, growing economic interest, existing security ties, and political complexity. This combination is rare, and rare combinations tend to attract attention from multiple directions. Part 11. From possibility to priority. As these factors converged, Greenland's role shifted. It moved from theoretical importance to practical consideration, not because any single development demanded immediate action, but because ignoring convergence carries risk. Geopolitical planning often focuses on what might happen if action is delayed. In Greenland's case, delay meant potential loss of influence in a region becoming more accessible and contested. For the United States, this transformed Greenland into a strategic priority. Not a crisis point, not a battleground, but a place where future dynamics could be shaped, or shaped by others. By the time Greenland's importance had been re-established, attention was no longer limited to environmental or economic change. Other actors were watching the same shifts. and they were drawing their own conclusions. In the next block, we will examine how global competition, particularly involving China and Russia, turned Greenland into a focal point of strategic interest beyond the United States. History rarely moves in isolation. When conditions change, multiple powers respond. Part 12. When other powers started paying attention. Strategic locations rarely attract interest from only one actor. When geography becomes valuable again, attention follows, often from multiple directions at the same time. As the Arctic began to change, Greenland did not go unnoticed. The same developments that altered American calculations were visible to others as well. New routes, new resources, new strategic corridors. For global powers, ignoring these signals would have meant falling behind. What changed was not Greenland itself, but the number of actors willing to engage with it. Part 13. China and the logic of long-term positioning. China's interest in the Arctic did not emerge suddenly. It developed gradually, framed through economic, scientific, and diplomatic engagement rather than overt military presence. Beijing began describing itself as a near-Arctic state. This language was deliberate. China does not border the Arctic, but it depends heavily on global trade routes, stable supply chains, and long-term access to critical resources. From China's perspective, the Arctic represented opportunity rather than territory. Shipping routes that reduce travel time between Asia and Europe. Access to minerals essential for advanced technologies. Participation in shaping rules before they solidify. Greenland fit naturally into this approach. Investment proposals focused on infrastructure. Research cooperation emphasized science and climate. Economic engagement appeared non-confrontational. But strategic value does not require military presence to matter. In geopolitics, influence is often established quietly, through access, partnerships, and dependency. From Washington's perspective, this approach raised concerns, not because of any single project, but because of cumulative positioning. Once influence is normalized, reversing it becomes difficult. Part 14. Why economic presence can become strategic leverage. Infrastructure shapes options. Ports determine access. Airfields enable movement. Investment creates dependency. Even when projects are civilian in nature, they can carry strategic implications. This does not imply inevitability, but it does require attention. In Greenland's case, proposals involving airports, mining, and transportation infrastructure drew scrutiny. For a territory with limited resources and high development costs, foreign investment can appear attractive. But from a security standpoint, control over infrastructure matters. Who builds it? Who maintains it? Who has access during crises? These questions are not hypothetical. They shape contingency planning. For the United States, allowing strategic infrastructure near its northern approaches to fall under external influence introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty is rarely tolerated in security planning. Part 15. Russia and the militarization of the Arctic. While China approached the Arctic primarily through economics and diplomacy, Russia followed a different path. Russia possesses extensive Arctic territory and has long viewed the region as central to its security and identity. As ice receded, Moscow expanded its Arctic presence. Military bases were reopened or modernized, naval capabilities increased, air defense systems were strengthened. From Russia's perspective, these actions were defensive. They protected territory, secured shipping routes, maintained deterrence. From the perspective of other powers, they altered the regional balance. The Arctic was no longer a low-tension environment. It was becoming an active theater of strategic signaling. Greenland's location placed it within this evolving landscape, not as a frontline position, but as a critical observation point. Part 16. Why the United States could not ignore this shift. For decades, American Arctic policy had been relatively restrained. The region was important but not urgent. That distinction began to disappear. China's economic engagement introduced questions about influence. Russia's military expansion introduced questions about balance. Together, they changed the strategic equation. Ignoring Greenland was no longer a neutral choice. It became a decision with consequences. From Washington's perspective, maintaining awareness and access in the Arctic was no longer optional. It was necessary to preserve strategic stability. This did not require confrontation, but it did require presence. Part 17. NATO alliances and the northern flank. Greenland's strategic value is also tied to alliances. As part of the Kingdom of Denmark, Greenland sits within the NATO framework. This creates both protection and responsibility. Changes in the Arctic affect not only bilateral relations, but alliance dynamics. Northern approaches matter for collective defense, surveillance coverage, response coordination, shared infrastructure. For the United States, Greenland plays a role within this larger system. It is not simply about national interest. It is about maintaining coherence across allied defenses. As competition increases, coordination becomes more important. And as importance increases, ambiguity decreases. Part 18. When competition turns quietly intense. One of the defining characteristics of Arctic competition is its subtlety. There are few dramatic confrontations. Instead, competition unfolds through presence, investment, and planning. Quiet decisions shape long-term outcomes. This makes the Arctic different from other regions. Escalation is slow, visibility is limited, consequences emerge over time. Greenland sits within this pattern. Its importance is growing not because of immediate crisis, but because of gradual alignment of interests. When multiple powers adjust strategy in the same direction, tension increases, even without direct conflict. Part 19. Why Greenland became a signal, not a target. Greenland is not a battlefield. It is a signal. It signals how seriously powers take the Arctic. It signals long-term intentions. It signals willingness to invest in future positioning. For the United States, engagement with Greenland communicates awareness. Not dominance, not confrontation, but attention. And in geopolitics, attention itself is a form of power. By this stage, Greenland's importance was no longer theoretical. Environmental change had opened access. Economic interest had followed. Strategic competition had intensified. What remained was the question of consequence. How do these pressures reshape policy? What options remained and which are closing? In the final block, we will examine what this growing focus on Greenland means for the future, and why decisions made now will shape Arctic dynamics for decades to come. History rarely announces turning points. It reveals them only after choices accumulate. Part 20. When strategy shifts from interest to commitment. At a certain point, strategic interest turns into strategic commitment. This shift rarely happens because of a single event. It happens when accumulated signals remove the option of indifference. In Greenland's case, that moment arrived quietly. Environmental change made access possible. Economic interest made engagement attractive. Geopolitical competition made inaction risky. Together, these factors transformed Greenland from a place worth watching into a place that required sustained attention. For the United States, this did not mean immediate confrontation or dramatic policy reversals. It meant something more subtle. Planning. Commitment in geopolitics often begins with preparation rather than action. Part 21. Why this is not about ownership or control. Much of the public discussion surrounding Greenland has focused on symbolic gestures and isolated headlines. But strategic reality operates at a different level. The United States' interest in Greenland is not about ownership. It is about access, stability, predictability, maintaining the ability to operate in the Arctic, ensuring that infrastructure aligns with allied security frameworks, preventing strategic surprises in a region growing more accessible each year. These goals do not require dominance. They require presence and cooperation. This distinction matters because misunderstanding intent often fuels unnecessary escalation. Part 22. The long-term Arctic calculation. The Arctic is not becoming important because of one crisis. It is becoming important because it is becoming integrated into global systems, trade routes, energy planning, security architectures. As these systems expand northward, they carry strategic implications with them. Greenland sits at the intersection of these developments. Its relevance is structural, not episodic. This means that attention will not fade when headlines move on. Policy built around structural relevance tends to persist, and once long-term planning begins, reversal becomes unlikely. Part 23. Why small places can shape big systems. Greenland's population is small, its economy is limited. But in geopolitics, scale is not measured only in numbers, it is measured in position. Control of access points often matters more than control of territory. Observation points can be as valuable as centers of production. In this sense, Greenland's influence exceeds its size, not because it seeks influence, but because geography assigns it a role. History contains many examples of small places shaping large outcomes. Greenland is becoming one of them. Part 24. A stable Arctic requires early decisions. One of the paradoxes of strategic planning is that stability depends on decisions made before crises emerge. Once tension becomes visible, options narrow. Early engagement allows for coordination. Late engagement often forces reaction. For the United States and its allies, Greenland represents an opportunity for early alignment. To establish norms, to coordinate infrastructure, to clarify intentions. These actions reduce uncertainty, and reducing uncertainty is one of the most effective ways to prevent conflict. Part 25. Why Greenland will remain relevant. Nothing about Greenland's importance suggests a temporary surge. Climate trends are long-term. Technological change is cumulative. Geopolitical competition is persistent. These forces do not reverse quickly. As a result, Greenland's role in global strategy is likely to grow rather than diminish. Not dramatically, not explosively, but steadily. And steady change often proves more consequential than sudden shifts. Greenland's return to strategic relevance is not an isolated case. It reflects a broader pattern in global politics. As technology evolves and environments change, geography reasserts itself. Places once considered remote become connected. Regions once ignored become central. The United States' interest in Greenland follows this pattern. It is not about ambition, it is about adaptation. Understanding this helps explain not only Greenland's importance, but how strategic priorities unfold more generally. In future episodes, we will continue examining how geography, competition, and long-term planning shape global politics, often long before the consequences become visible. History does not rush, it unfolds.